Thank you. All right, everybody. It is Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022, 4:01 p.m. I call the meeting of the Hudson Industrial Development Agency to order. Mrs. Drahusha, can you do a quick roll call for attendance, please?
Heather Campbell.
Here.
Paul Johnson.
Present.
Teresa Joyner.
Oh, Teresa, you're on mute.
Here.
Thank you. Cheryl Kazluka. Dominic Moranti.
Here.
Richard Wallace. Brian Wallace.
Here.
We have our quorum.
Excellent, thank you. So the first thing I need is a motion and a second to accept the minutes from the June 1st meeting of 2022.
I put a motion to accept the minutes from the June 1st meeting.
Thank you. Come on,
I'll second.
Beautiful. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No, excellent. All right, the next item that we have here is the board meeting time change. So I would, I'm gonna scoff a little bit. I would like to thank Hudson City Center for closing early, as Mike was detailing to me yesterday. The building now will be closing at, Mike, what is it, 4 p.m., correct? Is that there's not gonna be anyone at the desk. So we need to move the time, and I'm also going to be looking at an attempted change in location as well, if that's possible, because if we need to do it later, we won't obviously be able to meet at the CEDC offices. And Mr. Mayor, I can work with Tracy to figure out if we can use the chambers for City Hall for this, though. So Mike, do we have a predetermined time?
No, I know that you were talking 4:30 or 5. With Linda doing the minutes and moving the location, that would free Lisa up, and certainly Jessica Gabriel, who's joined us, and I are available to cover that meeting if it's at 4:30 or 5.
So keeping the same day of the week and time of the month, does it work for everybody to move this by 30 minutes and bumping it to City Hall? I mean, come on,
30 minutes which way? Up or down?
down. So it would be 4:30 instead of 4 o'clock.
Okay.
I will be all right for the summer, but starting in falls, I have an obligation on almost every Wednesday night that requires me to be out of the city by about 5:15. So that might be tight for me.
Okay. If we keep the time, Mike,
the city would just be a temporary spot too, because we are supposed to be going under a lot of construction.
That's true.
Well, if
Did you turn off, Mike?
No,
yeah, my thought process.
Actually, well, Mike,
my solution was not the solution.
Mike, before you go, Chris, I know we're getting to our video conferencing policy, but when we talk about extraordinary circumstances, given that City Hall, which would be the obvious alternative to this, would not be available, and the meeting spaces of CEDC are not available, would that, by the proposed law that we're going to be looking at today, allow us to conduct ourselves virtually until a time when either we could be meeting back in the CEDC or City Hall would be out of construction?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. That's intended for individual circumstances. So I don't think that would fit in that context. I mean, as you know, right now, we're still under the executive order that allows you to do video conferencing. But if that, I guess, if we're talking about once that expires, then you do need to have locations where people can be board members.
I'm sorry, can you turn the email off on the laptop that's in the room? Every time that it goes off, it cuts out the audio for the rest of us.
Hey, Ryan,
Yes,
what about 7th Street Firehouse?
Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Yeah, and we need to make sure that it not only Wi-Fi, that we would have some sort of technical capability. Go ahead, Mike.
I guess this is a special meeting. When is our next meeting?
Our next meeting will be,
First Wednesday.
July,
July 6th.
thank you.
and we'll still be under the emergency order through the.
Yeah, so we
14th.
can table it until then.
And why don't we do this? Why don't we plan on the July and August meeting here? And then if you have to look at another date, they'll give you a little bit of time to move it a day if it works for others at 4:30 or 5.
Yep. And
And
Mike,
then-
just to explain as well, is it permanently being doors locked at
They've
4?
always closed at 4. So I guess, I think we may have to find a way to, I don't know what the solution will be, but we will find a solution if it's best to stay here. And since we can at least get through the July meeting with, give me till the 6th of July to come up with an alternative.
That
I mean,
works.
even if I hire a college kid to come and be at the door, because technically right now, we need to be sure that people could come into the meeting if it was, they decided
Correct.
to show up.
Correct.
Once the emergency
Right.
goes off.
Yeah, and we can use the city until whenever we go under construction. Like if it's a temporary thing, it's possible, but it just wouldn't be long term.
Or let's try to find a solution that bridges the both the emergency order as well as the physical and time issues, so that we can look at something that works for everyone in August or September.
Maybe you can stay here until City Hall construction is done. And then
Yeah.
So is
Can you
it
say that
clear?
again, Chris?
I said, maybe you could stay here, figure out a way to stay here until City Hall construction is over and then move back over there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So is it clear 4:30 starting on the first Wednesday of next month? Is it gonna be 4:30?
No, we can keep the 4 o'clock for now. So we'll keep the 4 o'clock on July 6th for now.
Okay.
But between now and then, Teresa, we'll figure out exactly what the alternatives will be. I'm gonna vote for showing up 8 o'clock in the morning at Heather's with coffee for everybody.
Yay. You gotta get me out of the boat.
I see that head shaking. Excellent.
No.
I know,
Never
too
knew.
early. So, all right, moving on to our next order of business, we've got SEC 7 LLC, which is the Dock Street project. In the meeting packet provided to you, thank you again very much, Mrs. Strahushik. We have the resolution SEC 7 LLC negative declaration for seeker. We also have resolution SEC 7 LLC for approval following the public hearing that we held last week, I believe. I know the days are all running together for me. So the first thing I would need, I believe, is a motion and a second, and then a roll call vote on the negative declaration, unless any members of the board have any questions.
Could I just ask the board for the record, if they were not able to be present at the public hearing, if they've reviewed the record of the public hearing? Or if somebody can report on the record of the public hearing, please.
The public hearing was held here at Columbia Economic Development a week ago today at 4 o'clock. There were several members of the IDA here, and the chair acted as the hearing officer. There were 2 other members of the public on the call, but no one took the microphone when asked if they had any comments for the in support of or opposition to the project.
Correct.
Thank you.
So technically, there was nothing to listen to.
Great, I just wanted.
Yeah,
to
be on the record.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, so with that, I need a motion and a second on the resolution before we would roll call vote for the negative declaration.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
Thank you, Dominic. Mrs. Drahushik, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Brian Wallace,
Aye.
Kamal Johnson,
Aye.
Heather Campbell,
Aye.
Richard Wallace is absent, Teresa Joyner,
Aye.
Carol Casluga is absent. Dominic Moranti,
Aye.
you have your vote.
Excellent. All right, moving on to the second resolution today for approving the project located at 7 Dock Street. I also need,
Chairman, I would make note of the fact that Alan Foster is here representing the 7 SEC LLC if there are any questions.
thank you, Mr. Tucker. All right, so again, we need a motion and a second to proceed into the vote.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and a second.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Heather. Mrs. Drahushik, if you would, please.
Ryan Wallace,
Aye.
Kamal Johnson,
Aye.
Heather Campbell,
Aye.
Richard Wallace is absent. Teresa Joyner,
Aye.
Carol Casluga is absent. Dominic Moranti,
Aye.
passed.
Excellent. Congratulations, Mr. Foster and company. All right. Moving on to our next item of business today, we have continued discussion about the evaluation criteria and the needed policy update. So first thing I would like to do is very much thank Chris for all of her work, particularly on the bylaw amendments. You might have received, I believe separately. Chris, do you want to do the rules of order element first or the bylaw, the red line that we provided yesterday? I've got both pulled up.
Sure, I think that, and those are not going to be for consideration tonight, because I think the board should have them for another, meeting. So I think we'll just present them today and then
Perfect.
we can take the opportunity to review them, because this was a first presentation for this board. And I
Excellent.
think they may want to take some time to look at these. So
Yeah.
these are just really an update of the bylaws. The only question that I would have for the board is whether or not, I don't think you've had an assistant secretary or assistant treasurer for many years. I don't, you can continue to carry those positions if you want, if you should ever find that to be useful. So for now, I've carried them forward. There is a provision in the bylaws that we've added for indemnification of officers and employees and so forth. I'm assuming that your insurance policy includes fidelity coverage, but that's something that you should be looking at every year. So we've made that an express provision in here just as a reminder. And we've also expressly included at least a governance committee, audit committee, and finance committee. And you have had those in place for many years, but just to make that an express part of your procedures. And other than that, there's just a few updates. The other thing that we have for you to consider, and again, we can consider that at the next meeting, is a set of simplified operating procedures. Many people will say that they refer to Robert's rules, but it's not really an appropriate structure to try to use for a public meeting. And so we present a very simplified version of rules, which are basically the same thing that you've been using all these years. A motion, a second to put something up for a vote, and a process for the operation of public hearings, and a little bit of information about how FOIL is handled, and what happens when you get very, very basic, but I think a help for board members, especially new board members, and the public, and how you operate your meetings. So that's the purpose of those two documents for you to consider, and then I would recommend that you take them up at the next meeting, or send any questions or comments to me, perhaps, to be prepared to address at the next meeting.
Excellent. Chris, I want to thank you too, because the other thing that you sort of indirectly did for us here was actually digitize these from the 1970s paperback edition that I think we have been working off of. So
Well,
thank you.
Adobe Acrobat helps a lot. So.
It doesn't matter how we got to the finish line, it's that we got there. But for any of you that are in the room or have the digital packet, If you go to page 23 of what was available, you'll see exactly the antiquated version that we have been working from. So just on that element alone, Chris, thank you. And we can discuss at our next meeting.
We were done on the telegraph.
They might have been, you know, I mean, we're one step away from taking the signals of, or the photographs of smoke signals here. So the next thing that we have is our video conferencing meeting policy, which again, I would like to laud Chris in particular, because last night at the council meeting, we also reviewed our video conferencing policy. And I know that a lot of what was presented there was mirrored to be in line with what had been prepared for our agency here. Before we dive in, are there any questions from any of the members about what the new policy will mean in terms of the extraordinary circumstances? And actually, Chris, do you want to take a moment just to kind of really break down what this means in terms of the need of the quorum present in room?
Right. So this is going to go into effect, really, it's in effect, it will be in effect now, but we can, while the COVID emergency continues, that the governor has continued by executive order, we can continue to follow those procedures, which allow to use this kind of video conferencing for any of the board members and for the public for that matter. So you're allowed to continue to do this as long as the governor continues the executive order. Once that falls away and the current one expires July 14th, if it's continued, fine. If it's not continued, we're going to have to jump to these procedures. So that's the reason to have these procedures in place and ready. So what will have to happen is that, you know, COVID rules are now gone, and you're now going to have to be either in the room, in a room where the public is allowed to attend, which means a room that's ADA accessible, right? Just as it always was. You've always been able to be in more than one room. Many of the state agencies will have meetings from Buffalo, Albany, New York, and they all attend a meeting by video conference. But each of those locations, they have a place for the public to attend. So you can continue to do that. It's probably unlikely for Hudson to want to do that. If anybody's able to show up in person, they're probably going to show up in the city of Hudson. So, you know, that's probably not such an issue. What there is there's an extraordinary circumstances exception, which would allow someone to attend without allowing the public to be present with them in the room. If you have a quorum of people in a physical room in a place where the public can attend, so a quorum has to be there, and then the others who are subject to extraordinary circumstances could potentially attend by video conference without having to allow the public in the room. And, you know, the obvious exception is somebody who's under quarantine, right? Continues to be under quarantine and needs to be by themselves, and so is able to participate with a video conference. Caveat, it's now video conference only. You cannot use a telephone, and you have to have your screen on. They want everyone to be able to see everyone else. They want you to be able to see one another and hear, and they want the public to be able to see you as you conduct your discussions and deliberations, okay? So those are really critical elements of this new policy. Those are dictated by the statute. We listened to guidance provided by Conference of the Committee on Open Government, and they are presumably still, you know, going to elaborate later on that guidance, but for now, they have indicated that, you know, the extent to which extraordinary circumstances, you know, includes something like a vacation is something that the board should address in its own policy. The original legislation has things like illness in it as examples, but Coog has said they don't think that that's limiting, and that the board can be reasonable in its evaluation of what constitutes extraordinary circumstances, with the understanding that the legislature wants you to be present for the public, wants you to be available and present for the public. You know, that's the goal. And you have to have at least a quorum, right? Which for you is 4 members. So you know, you can look at that language. It's, I think, reasonably broad. If you want to narrow it, you may, but that's up to the board. So that's what we've prepared for you for now. And I did communicate with Crystal because I thought that if she wanted to recommend something in particular for your common council, it would be easier for all of you if we had the same set of rules for both bodies, so you weren't trying to remember which rule you were following in which meeting. So,
Question?
yes.
I know it's highly unlikely, but if there were in fact more than one public location,
Mhm.
as long as they are both ADA accessible,
Mhm.
and as long as the combination of people in both individual locations
Is a quorum.
is a quorum, it's okay.
Yeah, it all counts.
Okay.
So you can have somebody at City Hall and somebody here, and they both count.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
is the public allowed to participate by video at their own location for comment or during the public comment period?
So if you make video available to one of the board members, you're going to need to make video available for the public.
But you should do it
Anyway.
anyway.
Well, there's a difference.
Are you
though.
allowed to do it anyway?
There's a difference between what you're required to do as an IDA, which is to broadcast your,
Right.
information, which doesn't necessarily require the use
Two-way.
of Zoom, right? Versus, a two-way conversation, right?
And question following up on that. Are the public members also ruled by the fact that they must be on video as opposed to via phone or
No.
black screen?
No.
Just the
And
board
nor-
members?
Nor are consultants. The
Okay.
only ones that are governed by that rule. Ted can turn his video off if he wants to, and that's okay. But the rest of the board would be required to stay on video. Okay.
Yeah, it's just the officers and then whatever the main meeting location would be. That's standard.
Right. Right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So
So that's what's in front of you.
So what this means, everyone, is that if one of us does have a legitimate reason after July 14th, if it is not extended, to not be present, the rest of us will no longer be attending virtually unless you have that pre-existing circumstance that would be out there. So we will all need to be convening together.
Are we going to be it appears that she said that we can work on the extenuating circumstances that will allow a board member to not be present.
So,
at the meeting?
yes, so what I have provided in the draft here is that extraordinary circumstances is, let's see, which include disability, illness, caregiving responsibilities, or any other significant or unexpected factor which precludes the member's physical attendance. Such significant or unexpected factor may include vacation periods or periods when a member is working away from their residence in the city, not exceeding 4 weeks in a calendar year, or when a member is unable to attend at a meeting location as a result of unexpected travel difficulties. In other words, trying to give some concrete examples of the kind of thing that you would consider to be extraordinary circumstances. Outside of that, a board member who was not able to attend would just not be able to attend. They could listen to a meeting, but they cannot deliberate. So we had a lot of questions in one of the COOP sessions, the Committee on Open Government sessions, about what happens if somebody doesn't meet these requirements. And the answer is they could still listen to a meeting, just like a member of the general public, but they cannot participate in the deliberations. They were very clear about that. And they obviously couldn't be counted to a quorum, couldn't be counted as a vote.
Right. And that's the quorum thing is what worries me, because, like today we're allowed to be here, but right now it's technically Heather at the office, right? So, and on any given meeting, it's usually Heather and myself that are in person for that. So we would need to have the quorum base, except for, or the quorum base, or according to what Chris has written, and Chris, tell me if I'm misreading this though, but you're essentially allowed 4 excusable absences underneath that clause in the course of a year.
Well, I mean, I was trying to give you a sense of, I don't think it's expected that you're going to live in Florida half the year and expect to participate from there. I think that is not what the legislature would expect. So I was trying to put some reasonable lines around that as a basis for your, decision making. And again, this is, the parts of this that are, there are parts of this that are statutory, but this is an elaboration on the meaning of those provisions for your consideration.
And I think the issue really is with 7 people and the requirement that 4 be in person. As you point out, Mr. Chairman, at any one time, 2
Yeah.
people might have, 2 or 3 people might have a legitimate circumstance that would fall under the guidance of the policy that results in not being able to hold the meeting.
Mm.
So I would also note that we need to provide public notice ahead of time. So if there is a need to rely on the extraordinary circumstances, board members going to have to communicate. I mean, I think in this case with Michael, who's managing the meetings, and Lisa and Michael, and you know, to make sure that we have the meeting set up correctly for that situation.
Exactly.
You know, unless you're always going to do Zoom and it's always available. You know?
That'd be nice. That'll be nice if it was. Is there any room to add our own little touch to that?
So do you have an example of what you would
Well,
like to see?
you know, COVID phobia is a real illness when people are just afraid of being in a close proximity of others. Maybe there are people that just want to come and those that rather not, you know.
So, so it's not illness technically, right? Right, so you're not talking about a quarantine or something. It's just somebody who doesn't want to be near other people.
Preventative health.
Right, until the, you know, that the situation has been rectified to a point where no one is getting this particular illness. You know, you do have COVID phobia, people that really feel that if they're close to a bunch of people, they may get it, you know. So it's a real thing in the minds.
Yeah, no, I understand.
I was just thinking that could we like add our own little things that's not mentioned to it? Is there
I mean,
room?
if you think it fall, yes, because we've already added our own sort of fluff on this. So to the extent that you think it falls within the meaning of, you know, extraordinary circumstances, you know, we can specify something else that you all think fits that.
But Chris is,
Preventative health concerns.
Chris, under the disability section of it, would immune compromise be part of that?
Oh, I would
In-
think so.
Right,
I mean,
right,
I think, yeah, right, I would think so.
okay. So we don't have to do like a reasonable accommodation kind of thing. It's just under the disability.
I would think so. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that would be a reasonable interpretation of that, but I think Teresa's comment is a little bit different. I mean, I guess.
Yeah, it is, it's different. It goes beyond the disability, just, it is a disability if you have it, like, you know, if you do suffer from that. But it is not something that's probably documented anywhere but in the mind of the person that has it, you know.
Right. I mean, I think
think it
that,
gets a little too dicey there. If we just leave it up to interpretation.
Yeah, and it's also going to put undue burden on the same members that are going to be constantly showing up in person, right? Like, so respectfully, I, for one, also have a few other jobs that I work, Teresa, right? And so there's going to be times where, you know, I won't physically be in Hudson. I will be able to use this legislation to call in from the road when I'm traveling for my full-time job. But then if there's not a quorum that's able to be met, I mean, you know, Jamal and Heather, their full-time jobs are this city. So, you know, assumably they would be local. Dominic, TBD, I know that, you know, you're approximately local, but, you know, if the same members aren't coming in at all, right, if the ones that are going to be not available, that does end up putting the undue burden of always being present and in person on the same members due to the desire of others to not be present.
True, you're right, you're absolutely right.
I agree. And I think it's just, you know, within our membership, we just got to just realize we're going to have to step up when we need to step up, you know, to fill in if there's, you know, if you can't make it, then there's no doubt, then, you know, I would do whatever I can to make sure that we're there.
Is there a notice, Chris, that we can put in this where people need to people need to respond within, the week prior to the meeting, whether or not they're intending to be in person or not? Because
Well,
I think most people will have a legitimate understanding of where
I
they
think
may
it'd
be
be best
traveling
to-
on
Best to
vacation.
be leaving that vague. I
so
mean,
we have language. So the
Yeah.
language that we have in the document is that the member who's unable to attend at a meeting location will notify the board chair and a copy of the CEDC staff as soon as practicable that they are unable to attend for a reason that constitutes circumstance. And what we do know is that if we're going to hold a meeting by video conference, the notice has to be posted 24 hours before. So if you are in the practice of always posting a notice of video conference, then that may be workable because you'll always have a video link posted and you won't have to be scrambling at the last minute to try to set up a video conference, compared to people who don't do this on a regular basis. But then at least, obviously, at least 24 hours notice would be certainly appreciated, I'm sure, by the staff so that they can be prepared.
well, but the reality is if you have a true,
If you get ill, you get ill.
if you have a
right?
true emergency circumstance, it's probably something that, going to be at the very last minute.
So that's why we say as soon as
Hold over.
practicable, right? So we're gonna ask people to provide that information, the board members to provide that information as soon as practicable. Presumably by email to both Brian and to Michael.
But yeah, just saying, like, there's kind of two different phases. There's the clearly foreseeable ones, like I have my vacation plan for X, or I have a business trip plan for Y, and then there's the one where you wake up with 100 tweeting for the day of the meeting. So
Right.
you can only do what you can do.
And in that case, you may have.
And we could very well have had a situation before any of this, that you didn't have a quorum because one or two people got sick.
Right.
The only good news from our perspective is that the bill that would have prohibited elected officials from serving on IDAs did not pass the both houses. So we have you all back.
We can debate on whether that was a positive or a negative reaction.
So do we want to vote on this today, or do we want to table this so everybody can digest it and ask what their final questions would be at the 6th meeting?
I'm okay with it, voting on it.
Do it on the 6th. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I mean, I'm happy to vote on it now.
I think actually there's 3 of us. Dominic, Mr. Mayor, are you both?
I
I'm
mean,
comfortable voting on it now.
yeah, I'm okay voting on it.
All right, I need an introduction in a second.
I'll introduce.
Oh,
And
all right.
Mr.
Heather
Mr.
first,
Chair,
then Dominic.
Mr. Chair, before you vote, I just want to again confirm, Michael, we talked about the public hearing, but the public hearing, you also had a public hearing on this
This bill.
matter.
And even less people spoke at that hearing.
Yeah,
In other words, there were no comments.
Yeah.
but you did
No
hold a public
comments on
hearing.
this.
Public hearing was held, and duly held, and
Thank you.
Yeah.
you have it in the record.
Just so that's in the meeting record. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Mrs.
sorry,
Drahushik.
Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure that's on record.
that's okay. Mrs. Drahushik.
Brian Wallace,
Aye.
Jamal Johnson,
Aye.
Heather Campbell,
Aye.
Richard Wallace is absent, Teresa Joyner,
Aye.
Carol Kasluga is absent, Dominic Moranti,
Aye.
passed.
All right. Moving on. So Ted, thank you for sitting through the litany of things that we needed to approve here today. So for those of you that were at the last meeting, you know that we presented the first version of the evaluation criteria and framework. And in that time since, I've met with Ted, as has Chris, to refine that presentation a little bit further. I believe further than what's in the packets, unfortunately, today. And additionally, I can have Chris also speak to a little bit of the, Chris, go ahead, sorry.
Anything after 4 o'clock is good, then, folks.
Okay, well.
We're not gonna vote on it today.
Right, I don't think, Chris, I don't think they made it in the packet, but we can speak to it at least, and then socialize it and continue on July 6th with them. But
The one that was earlier.
Chris, can I turn it to you very quickly just to summarize the meeting yesterday, specifically around the practices and policies that the evaluation criteria would impact?
So I think I'm gonna let Ted speak to the matrix, but what we did was to take the existing policy regarding uniform criteria for evaluation of projects. You're required to have uniform criteria to evaluate projects. That means these are things that you're going to take into account when you think about a project and decide whether or not to provide financial assistance for that project. And so there are some criteria which you're required by statute to take into account. So we've sort of bifurcated the draft criteria to lay out first, these are the statutory criteria. You need to take into account the extent to which jobs will be created, the extent to which the estimated value of exemptions, whether the impact of the project on existing and proposed businesses.
And Chris, this is the red
yeah.
line that I have up on the screen.
Okay, okay, great. So those criteria you're required to take into account. The impact on the environment, energy, conservation measures, and that sort of thing. So then, as a result of the conversations that Ted has been leading, we've added some additional criteria that are based on the issues and concerns that were raised in the context of that process. And so this draft includes a variety of factors, which again would be considered in the review of the project. Wage and income factors, workforce training matters, economic impacts on the city and or county, alignment with local planning efforts, and impact on affordable housing goals and additional positive impacts. And each of those we could go through in detail, but maybe Mr. Chairman, you want to switch to Ted's matrix next?
Yes.
So this really identifies all the things that information we would elicit from an applicant. So we'll have to modify our application to include this information if it's not already in there, so that the applicant would have to explain how and whether their project meets these particular goals and concerns. And then we would then undertake a review as a board. You would undertake a review of those applications and consider these kinds of issues as you decide whether or not a project merits your assistance.
Well summarized. And Ted, I've got this projected on the screen if you want to just highlight the additional categories in the scale and what we scratched from core to be in line with the statutory requirements and the additions that we made on the scaled elements.
Yep, absolutely. So with respect to core, the statutory criteria gives the board the ability to consider what is in the core. So those are, we've summarized them in 7 areas. The meets New York State and Hudson IDA requirements is a catch-all, but that's there to ensure that the application has considered the particular criteria. There's 2 criteria, the project community commitments that board members can consider. The first is that the applicant has considered the criteria evaluated and engaged with stakeholders, so it's a process-related criterion. The second is that the the developer has considered community commitments, and there's a variety of commitments there that are, some of which are repeated in the scale. So MWBE participation, EEO, inclusionary housing, and others. With respect to the scaled criteria, we have 6 different columns. The first relates to new, permanent, or retained jobs. The points in that category go from 0 to 3. So the more jobs, the more benefit, or the higher the project is evaluated. That's, I think jobs is pretty straightforward. The second column is projected wages. A project that is paying all minimum wage as they're required to doesn't get any points. But if they go above, but if they're at or above $15 an hour, they get 1 point. So that's looking at, for instance, just to use an analogy, the downstate minimum wage. If New York City and the New York City metro region is at 15, we want to reflect that the project is above the minimum wage at $15. Increasing $5 per hour gets the project to an additional point at $20 and above, $25 per hour and above across all job categories. We'll get the project 3 points. Economic impacts on the city and the county is the third column. 1 point for retaining existing businesses, 2 for supporting local businesses or clusters. Locating in a distressed area, addressing blight or underutilized space will get 2 points. Purchasing construction materials and or labor from the city or within the county will get 3. Workforce training, if employer provides on-the-job training, that's no points. We expect them to do that, or we hope that they will. As they start to provide investment, they get a point. If they provide additional investment that's not otherwise available, such as developing an approved apprenticeship program or a community college degree program, they get 2 points. If there's additional investment beyond that, they can earn 3. The fifth category relates to environmental. It relates to affordable housing and environmental points. The previous matrix we shared had a column dedicated to environmental, and they would get 2 points for. So just to draw your attention to the 2, added environmental here to affordable housing, just to reflect that so a project could get environmental. That's not necessarily housing, but if it's housing related, it can get 2 points either for including inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing, or including adopting energy efficiency in its project. For projects that have rental housing, being consistent with the city housing plan gets 1 point, and including workforce housing gets 3. The last category is a creativity, adding additional services or additional benefits. Having considered community needs for goods and services is a baseline, 0 points. Promoting local and small business uses gets 1. Increasing diversity of services or goods offered gets 2, or increasing regional tourism or promoting arts and culture gets 2. Having MWBE commitments in construction or equal employment opportunity and workforce utilization gets 3. The notion is that all 7 core criteria need to be met. The 2 points available for considered criteria are up for grabs too. There's up to 18 points across these 6 columns, maximum of 3 points per column. So if working with Mike and the staff at the IDA, the notion would be if a project scores above between, I think it's always up to the board to discuss and decide, but between 7, I think baseline between 7 and 17 points, they're eligible for category 1 or base level of exemption benefits. If they're above 17, they're eligible for an enhanced set of benefits, sort of at category 2. In between now and when the board decides to act on this matrix, should it decide to act, interested in feedback from Mike and in particular about what those benefits would be. But thinking something like the base level benefits would be similar to what are offered now, maybe a 10-year abatement at 50%, declining each year to 5% to 0. An enhanced benefit could be a 15-year exemption starting at 100% and then declining 5% annually going forward until it hits 0. main goal, I think, today is to present and to have the board, ask to field questions, see if there's additional feedback to incorporate in a future draft that gets voted on at a subsequent meeting.
Well, first we would want to put it up at a public meeting first,
Right.
and then have it for vote for adoption. That's correct.
And
Mike, I
Mr.
want to turn
Chairman,
over. Go ahead.
I was just going to note, in order to implement that project scoring part of this rubric, I think we would need to take up the tax exemption policy, which is a separate document, which currently provides for only one rubric for tax exemption scale, and everything else is a deviation. So I think if the board would like to discuss, or maybe get some input from Mike on these levels of tax abatement, if those are what are recommended, then we would take a redraft of that document to present with this evaluation criteria.
And Mike, in that thinking, right? I mean, because we've always just operated underneath whatever the sort of standard modus of operandi is that we've given out. And Chris, I look to you on this question as well. Is it possible to lower what that first level package is? I mean, do we legally have to have a minimum of the 10-year? Is there a 5-year that we can offer as like a base? The 10-year becomes the level 2, and then something,
I think it
more
really depends. I don't know how a business with 5 people ever gets to 17 on this score, because if you look at, my question is, what if it's a new build on a clean greenfield? How do I get a point? How do I get one of the 7 mandatory points for historic preservation? And then, if you have 5 to 9 employees, you can only get 1 point across the board.
No, Mike, you're misreading this. So
Okay.
every column going from left to right? So you can get your 2 points.
I think what we need to do is we need to have a work session where we can present several potential projects to see if someone can get a score of 17. And then, I do think that.
Are you going to make yourself available in the next week, Mike? Because again, where are we on our moratorium before the hotel votes come up?
But you can always extend that. Unfortunately, I'm away for 2 weeks starting Friday, but I will be available by phone for meetings.
All right. But, as soon as you're back, then I would, if you'd like to have
we can work on
this, I would absolutely have the workshop, because I don't intend on moving any of the others forward until we have this in place.
I don't want to penalize people in a reverse way, where the more jobs you get, the more you have more you have to do. It's kind of,
well, that's not exactly how this is. I'm a little bit befuddled here, Mike, because we've had several conversations that you've joined us as well. So, nobody gets penalized by having more. Can I finish before you interrupt me? Thank you. Nobody's penalized for getting more jobs in this whatsoever. They actually get a point for it. That's 1 point of 3. You want to bring 50 jobs in, you get 3 points, but you may only have considered the impact or the need for affordable housing. So you get 0 in that column for that one element of the square itself. So you're already 3 on the board, in addition to what you get on the core, you're at 10. And he said between 7 and 17. So I'm happy to have a second meeting where we'll break down the math for you. Absolutely. But if you want to troubleshoot it,
Tim, I thought that's what Ted was asking us to do.
Ted, do you want to frame?
I'm confused.
Yeah. I mean, so wanted to present. So what is in front of you is a result of the 3 workshops that we had, a number of conversations we had, and feedback we've received from the board as well as from council. What you have in front of you is a presentation. I think it makes sense to, I think that if the suggestion is what would a project actually score, we could talk about, a hypothetical here as sort of the chair was, or we could, score a subsequent application, but just want to, we do need to revise the application, like council said, as well as revise a number of policies to implement.
I don't disagree. with the concept, it's just, it's conceivable that a project with the 6 columns, an environmental sustainability community, there's only a chance to get 2 points, and it's very limiting in terms of if it's not on an industrial site or brownfield. I mean, and I guess, and maybe I'm, if they did leads, but not everyone can do that, and not everyone can put solar panels on their roof. And so, I mean, I just want to be sure that, and again, it goes to what Ted was saying. If you got the core 7, do you get the base requirements? I had never anticipated, Mr. Chairman, your suggestion today in any of our earlier discussions of perhaps you only get a 5-year pilot if you only get 7. I mean, that was new to me. So I guess.
Well, no, it's a way that we can look at the scaling. What I'm saying though, across here, and Mike, I just want to make sure you're clear, right? So if it's an affordable housing project and they intend on, one of the examples that I threw out to Chris is, we know that there's a construction program at Columbia Green. If they're willing to bring on-the-job training to those students to help actually build what they're going to be building here, if the developer wants to create some sort of partnership between the construction company, which we all know arguably will be from out of the area, but that there's another added benefit there, well, there is workforce training that they would get a point in as well. What are the impacts of that affordable housing that is going to be here? Will they have retail spaces? Okay, excellent. Maybe that's another point that's there. The categories across the top are not meant to just solely classify the type of project. Every project has the opportunity to be viewed in all 6 of these columns to gain an aggregate set of points.
I do think, Ted, what you said yesterday was that, that the core, what you've described as core requirements, were core requirements to consider the issues and not necessarily to meet the requirement. So for example, I think, Mike, you asked about
Historic preservation.
small, I can't read it.
Historic preservation.
Well, that's not in this one. This one has workforce
Yeah, you're
training.
looking
at-
Okay. Workforce training meets project use definition. The application is complete. Planning and seeker approval is, if applicable, is complete. But for requirement evaluation meets the requirements. For example, isn't moving somebody from another part of the state, so forth, and likely to be completed on time. So those are now the core requirements.
But if the core requirement, I apologize, I was,
Yeah, it's a different
I hadn't
version. I know,
seen,
that was one of the changes.
I didn't get to see the version, I wasn't at that meeting, but when you look at workforce training, if you get it as a, what do you have to do to qualify to have it as a core versus what you have to do to get a 1 point on the second tier? And I'm just looking at it practically. I don't disagree with the concept or the methodology.
So what we've proposed is that it becomes a section that they actually have to put into the application. So it could be as simple as it is not applicable to our solution, or we do not intend to offer workforce training, but at least address it within the application process. But if they are, and they do.
The other question would be, they have 50 employees, but they're only willing to send 3 to training. Do they get, I'm just trying to, I'm coming from it from a developer trying to game this, I guess is where I'm coming from, not necessarily opposing or objecting to the model.
Yeah, I tend to look at that the same way too. I tend to be a glass half empty kind of gal. So I immediately look for the things that, like, considered. What does considered mean? We asked them, hey, have you thought about the community? And they say, we sure did.
Right. So I understand that, Heather, but then again, they don't get any points for that.
And I think it's a dialogue and a discussion.
And that's what the core, that's what adding to the core criteria was meant to do, is to start the discussion on that. Mike, if it's not in the application, they're not even going to think about it or approach it, right? So it's kind of like a stop sign. Who's going to slow down at the intersection if you don't have any sort of indicator there? That's kind of what making it part of the core requirement to address is meant to do, is meant to raise the issue to start with. And then on the
When Ted-
scale is where we want to unpack what is that workforce element that you're going to do, right? So Heather, to your point, we can be the naysayers, glass half empty is all we want, but frankly, we're going to ask them, tell me more about the workforce training program you plan to implement. And it will be up to us subjectively to ask the questions to uncover that it's 3 out of 50, in which case then subjectively, each of you as a board member needs to grade this accordingly. Do you deem it that it gets 2 points, or do they get 0 points? Because clearly 3 out of 50 is not a percentage that's going to be of value to the workforce or the community.
And I also, when Ted called me just before this call about this, I said my hope would be that all developers would get this, whatever, 14 extra points and get as much benefit as they can. And you want this to motivate the developer to see, well, I get X for handling the core requirements appropriately. And if I can get 7 to 14 points above, I get something else. I think you'll motivate the developer that is well capitalized and responsible and experienced to, they'll see this as a place they want to do business because of how this is structured.
It's also interesting because as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, so there's going to be some sort of break evens here, let's say about workforce training, right? So if they're going to get a better tax exemption because they're offering workforce training, how do we balance the amount of the additional exemption value that they get versus the cost that they're going to undertake with that workforce training? Are we trying to make that a break even? Are we trying to help subsidize the training, or are we trying to do it the other way around? So I think there are some really interesting questions to that end. I can also see those questions differing depending on the size of the deal. So I think those two elements, I mean, we talked about just having maybe, a few tax abatement schedules, but I'm not even sure if 2 or 3, it might be fine, but it's just interesting to think about what a different tax abatement would be for, a $5 million project versus say a $25 million project.
Right. And that's why, and Heather, that's why I'm suggesting, like, rather than our standard, let's set one below our standard, our current standard, and let's set one above, or attempt to above our current standard, so that we do have that range based on what the size of that investment is coming into the community. Go ahead, Mike.
I do, the one other thing I would say to echo Mike's comment is not only necessarily looking at using this as a sample, but if we look at the past 2 or 3
let's grade
deals
them.
that the IDA actually did and see how the criteria actually works and see how they would have scaled, I think that would be very useful insight into determining what are their scale ranges. Is it 10, 15, 18? Is it,
Or would they have had to do more? Would we have had to require them to do more to get there?
So
I think that's,
go ahead, Mike.
the other aspect of this is, when you look at the state required economic, fiscal, and financial analysis of these deals, it's an evaluation by the IDA required by statute of what are the cost of the benefits versus what are the cost of the incentives requested. And I don't have to go back and look, but if it's less than 1, it's not a project that people should be doing.
Right.
That
also begs the question of how do you put a value on training?
Well, so now, because of the city being a city, you're losing 25% of whatever the mortgage recording tax is, and you're losing 7% of whatever the sales tax exemption is. So really, one area, which just goes to your point, Chairman, is the area that's going to make this up or not is in the pilot schedule.
Correct. That's our leverage.
Because basically, I think I could show you mathematically that the 1% fee is going to be absorbed by whatever the mortgage tax exemption and the sales tax exemption is to the city. if you're looking at this just from the perspective of the city, not the county and the school district. The school district will always benefit because, the tax on the vacant land or abandoned building or underutilized, unimproved property will result in less taxes than an improvement. The answer you can never answer is, if it stayed vacant for another year, would someone come and do something better with it?
Stayed vacant for another year, A, or, and this is where we've got the originality of the project also being graded, is it something that has come to us that has not come to us before that we actually need and that would benefit the community itself? Does the good of what it brings outweigh the economic benefit, right? So
And that's, I think, where you started out. How can you incentivize someone in this process to know that if they, how do you tell them what you're looking for so that they know they can get extra points? And maybe that's something you prioritize as you go. And,
well, and that's the CBA rider as well, right? I mean, that is the what organizations can you look to get involved with? What maybe there's a section that we can collaborate on as well, that is, what projects do we admire that have been done by other municipalities within the state that we would like to see attempted here, right? So,
and I think the other part of that is that list should change, right? If you're looking for housing and all of a sudden you have make a determination as a policy that you've reached your goal, you might then want more industrial, or you might want more recreational, or you might want.
And that was always the intent of that document, was to be living, breathing, and evaluated annually for the CBA that's there, though. So what I'd like everybody to do then before the next meeting is please really do dig into this and come prepared with questions so that we can finalize this. I mean, this has been now going on since April. We're moving into July. Let's try to get this locked to a place where we can do a public hearing on some input. And in addition to that, Mike, I do like the idea. We'll call a special meeting in July then to run through some of the past scenarios, because I think Heather is absolutely right about where would they have fallen and what does that do to our sort of predetermined menu of what we can actually offer. And then let's publicize that so that people understand it isn't just a flat rate deal with Hudson. We are a flexible IDA that is willing to find a few different avenues to work with people. And we now have, hopefully then with the next item here too, updating that CBA to be reflexive of those types of projects that we're looking for goes into it.
And I think we could do that for the meeting on the 8th, because we only had 3 projects that have come through.
The 6th, right?
Well, we have 6. I'm sorry. We've got the 620 Union, Pocketbook Factory, and the Galvin projects, and this, and the one we did today.
Correct.
You can go back and look at Hudson Terrace too for fun.
Well, I don't know. We have any documentation on that. Was so long ago. Right, that was over 10 years.
No, but that would be good. I mean, go ahead, Heather.
Oh, I was just you can continue that. This is a slightly divergent pot. So.
Oh, I was just going to say, no, it's a good idea, right? Let's plan to run through each of those on the rubric individually and see where it nets.
And I guess, if something, and not to bring up the elephant in the room, but it's always good to have the discussion. A hotel that generates 4% bed tax, how do you value that in this model? I would assume it's where there was one where it increases the economic vitality of the city and the region. But I think that
But again, that's where the scaled interpretation is, right? And to remind everybody, right, that's the beauty of the scale too. It's interpreted by the members of the board individually. It's not the board using one rubric and collectively agreeing on those. It's that Heather scores separately from Dominic, from Teresa, from the mayor, from myself. And then we need to discuss why each of us decided to grade it where it is, find the alignment in the agreement to determine that final package. And then ultimately, as Chris pointed out from the very beginning of this exercise, is that outside of the statutory requirements, there are no hard scorings / numbers that make it binding outside of what New York State prescribes that we do and how we operate by law. Chris, correct?
Right, you mean in terms of your criteria?
Yes.
Right.
So it's meant to modulate how we're currently thinking about the projects and seeing where, Mike, to your point, what's going to be more beneficial from us and how does it motivate developers to come with a much more original concept and idea to the table.
But as opposed to someone spending $5,000 on workforce training and checking a box, you know, $1 million over 10 years in occupancy tax, you know, how do you weigh those things? And I think that becomes the hard part for each of you who serve on the board.
Absolutely, but all the better for public debate, right?
Right.
And that's where, is it $1 million, and just give us the opportunity to say, could you actually increase what you would be doing in workforce training, right? I mean,
Right.
In my years of watching this board, nobody seems to ever go back to really negotiate hard outside of the CEDC to see what they can push there. I mean, I'd rather have that much more open and transparent to say, we're looking for you to do more for the amount of incentive that you're asking of us. So
I think,
My
go ahead, Heather.
My comment was going to be, you know, obviously criteria are only as useful as your ability to monitor them.
Correct.
So at some point when people are reviewing all of these, I think we also need to be considering how are we going to monitor and make sure that those criteria that are being judged are actually being executed. So obviously just looking at it immediately, there's two different phases. There's a construction phase. If you've got somebody that's committing to buy construction materials in the county or in the city, we need some ability to get that information documented, make sure it actually happened. We also need something to understand what happens if that does not happen, even though we've scored them as a positive. What do we claw back? How much do we claw back? When does that happen, et cetera, and so forth. So ditto with, you know, housing and number of staff and all of that. I mean, in the very basic things, you know, like in the Hudson Terrace one, they said they were going to retain jobs. And so they have to report every year. They send a little report that says, we've still got 6 people working, and that's their documentation. But the level of complexity of all of these elements, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they shouldn't be here. I'm just saying we need to think about implementation as much as
absolutely.
evaluation.
And we've touched on that with Chris in terms of like what that does to sort of the contractual rider at the end of what reporting that they're going to need to be turning in. I mean, the reporting needs to be on the awarded candidate, if you will, or the applicant. But, you know, I think that's, as we move through the rubric itself, let's focus on getting, are we aligned with how we want to look at the project? And then Chris, we can work with you to determine, okay, now what measures do we put in place based on the ones that we want to keep?
And you're going to update your application to reflect the rubric. You're also going to have to develop an annual reporting mechanism for each of the awardees.
Right.
Is that
So,
Jamie?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, Ryan, and I agree to like an 85% extent, but we also have to be thinking about execution, at least in the back of our heads, because there's no point in deciding that this is a perfect element in the rubric to, you know, communicate what the IDA's importance are if we really have no way of determining whether it was achieved or not. So there has to be a little bit of consideration of implementation while we're reviewing the criteria.
And as an example, the commensurate with city median wage, is that for on average for all?
Yeah, we updated that. We updated it to a new draft.
I didn't get the handout. Okay.
The wage is now changed to be.
Current minimum wage across.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because the other one was impossible to.
Right. We made some improvements from.
Yeah, I missed that yesterday. I was there.
I'll be very own.
Thank you.
So read it, you know, and comment on it. But it's a different version.
Yeah, so that's this, what you have now is much more, goes to what Heather, you can track this.
Yeah,
The other would have been very hard to.
That's why, I mean, I prefaced this with what Ted sent last night. And so Mrs. Drahushik, I believe you were copied on it. Chris sent the red line version of the statutory criteria in section, what did Chris, keep me honest, sections A through C, with B being the additional criteria or additional scalable evaluation section. And so if for those in the room, well, actually, we'll just send it all digitally and get it posted again by the end of this week on the website. But those will be the materials to review and look at, because it is far tighter than what we had before.
And then the question is, could you give someone a 1 under workforce housing if they were creating 2 apartments, and they had 100 employees, or, but you have to give them all 3 under each section.
Yeah, it's
There's-
a lot of Venn diagrams going on here.
Well, and the point I think is to have the discussion that we're having now, as well as to look back and see what would be the result of the scoring, and then prospectively to look forward and see what you could get,
right,
while making projects still attractive to developers. Engage them in a conversation that will hopefully yield what the public wants and what the board wants, as well as what the development community wants.
And I think the chairman's point is well taken, that to get them to do the baseline, you have to have something below, whether it's 80% or 50%, becomes the board's decision. But, if you can get the baseline for doing just the core requirements.
You can get the you get the baseline for the core requirements, and the workforce training element is there because not everything is going to come in with a housing option, but nearly everything comes in that has some form of applicable workforce thing in it. And it is a sign on the road. It is literally putting it into the application process. The response can be no, and that's fine, but make it a part of the application process so that people actually have to pause and think about it at some point. Otherwise, it just sits into the other pile of the criteria, and they're going to blow past it because they realize that it's not anything that is critical for them to consider. Workforce is probably the most universal element that we have there, right? So that's where then if that's a stepping stone into them understanding the other issues that we're hoping to find a way to address, great. At least it's a start.
And there may be a way over time where if someone isn't, based on the nature of the project, that we could have them help fund workforce programs that are to contract out to do that work. If they're not, not every developer is going to be able to run their own workforce program.
Well, but that's where we've got the county. That's
Right.
where we've got the college and Questar,
Yep.
and even COARC in some instances. I mean, like
And
we have a
even at some
litany of
point,
things that are
a not-for-profit that exists or is new could be funded through that mechanism.
Correct.
So that you have a sustainable program as opposed to, someone just, going back to the hotel example, you do a 6-week training program for 20 people before you open, and then after you open, as one person leaves at a time, you're not really going back to that model of training that you did in the beginning. But I think as people give you their plan, knowing what you're looking to achieve, they can be creative, and maybe there isn't a single response to some of these second levels of metrics.
Right. And again, it's the entire exercise is a step in changing the thinking and processes of these developers that are here, right? So that's why I'm not afraid to be bold in what we're trying to put forth and making that third tier nearly unachievable, right? Maybe we'll meet some hyper-driven developer that actually says, you know what, I can do this and I can do it right. They'll get a ton of press out of it if they do it right in that aspect. But for everybody else, being the average B or C student, as it would be on the application, may be enough. I mean, it's definitely not going to deter the business. And I think that even offering the lower level scale might be a bit of an incentive for some developers that may not have the pockets of others to come in. I mean, I know it's not the deal sizes that we want, but I think anything to spur additional investment in the community is the way to be thinking, particularly in light of the current economic environment.
And we're going to be having conversations with developers as they come in and we go through these rubrics. So it's not just like we're going to score and not, go into detail on what we would like to see.
I think you've left it generalized enough, but specific in a way that you might have 2 projects similar, but based on who the developer is and what they're willing to do, multiple different ways to get to the end result.
One could
Yeah.
come in and say, you know what, I'm going to underwrite a check for $100,000 to Columbia Green Community College to use the existing network of services and professional education that we have here to help better the workforce in that example. The other may turn around and say, I'm actually going to bring in and do a 1 year of workforce training with my managers from XYZ other shop that we happen to have. And to your point, Mike, how do you weigh out what the benefit or the risk is? I think it's well, let's talk about your program versus what we would have here, right? And again, it brings more options to the table. So everybody, please give the new rubrics a look. Mrs. Drahushik, if you would. I'll make sure that you've got what Chris sent in terms of the original versus the red line, and then what Ted had and what I had projected on the screen today to distribute to everyone. With that, I can skip the community benefits agreement sponsorship right now. I briefly talked to Mike about that. When we are at that point, I'm going to ask all of you to help vote on spending some IDA money on having it fine-tuned to meet Hudson's criterias and standards so that it is branded and looks, for our city. And the last element that I have here, if none of the board have any other business or comments that they'd like to discuss.
No, but I do have to step out for another meeting.
Not a problem. I'll open it up this time. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for joining. I'll open it up for public
Thank you.
comment. All right. With no public comment, I'm looking for a motion and a second to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Everybody made that motion. Anybody want to?
Second, I'll second.
All right. Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Even those without a vote.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you on the
Thank you,
6th.
everybody. And we'll get you some early numbers by the beginning of the week.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say,